Welcome to this webinar from CBF Heartland. I want to say good afternoon and thank Sam Harrell for joining us here today. I'm so glad you could be here, Sam. This is second recording of a webinar that we've done. And later today or tomorrow, I will post this recording to Vimeo and our YouTube channel, as well as our website, cbfheartland.org. and post it to our Facebook page as well. So I want everyone who's watching this to feel free to share this recording with whoever they feel may benefit from it. It's not intended just for CBF Heartland use. So as we get started, I thought I would just introduce Sam Harrell to you with a little bit of a story. Sam's title is Associate Coordinator of Global Missions for CBF Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and he's been in that role for a handful of years now, I think. And prior to that, Sam and his wife Melody served as CBF field personnel in Kenya. I think, Sam, the very first time that we met in person, I was actually leading a small mission team to Kenya to work at a child development center that we had been partnering with you on. And our team had gotten off the plane in Nairobi, and we were standing in the customs line with a whole bunch of stuff. And the gentleman there realized that we had a lot of things, and they were very curious about that. And they were kind of suggesting pretty hard that I was supposed to be paying a big hefty fee. And you were over on the other side of the customs, and you saw the predicament I was in and somehow found a side door or a back door to rescue me from that situation. You came over and started speaking, I think it was fluent Swahili, with that gentleman, and everything was smoothed over and just fine. So thank you, Sam, for rescuing me from that situation.
All the side doors have now been sealed, unfortunately.
Right. So Sam, you're here to help us do a global missions forecast, which I know is probably pretty difficult, but I thought maybe we could start out just by you sharing a little bit about the focus of your job. What do you actually do with CBF?
Yeah, so the Global Missions Department is sort of broken up. We have a coordinator for global missions, and that's Dr. Stephen Porter. And I like to say he does the 30,000-foot view. He does a lot with our external partners, Baptist World Alliance, our state and regional organizations, gets our philosophical view straight. My work is primarily to direct CBF's field ministries. So I'm a practitioner at heart. If I have theology in me, it's practical theology. So my love is to help field personnel who are stationed in 20 countries around the world. We have 65 field personnel at present. My job is through a group of dedicated field personnel themselves called the Field Ministries Team, to help capacitate the work of field personnel, to help their impact increase, really. Now, our Field Ministries Team are essentially regional supervisors and accompaniers with our field personnel who are based in various regions around the world: Europe, Africa in the Middle East, Asia, and North America. And so we have 6 folks on that team, and they're my team. I meet regularly with them. They are not only supervisors, they are fully fledged field personnel who have taken, because of their experience and dedication and long-serving ability, they have taken on the responsibility of accompanying other field personnel. And we like to use that term, accompaniment. You think of it maybe as walking a mile in somebody else's shoes. You listen to a person who has been where you are, and you appreciate the perspective that they have more than you do somebody trying to lord it over you. So these colleagues of mine are folks just like me who've been in the field for a while, and who are selflessly giving of their time, although they do have their own ministries. So our tasks are to help field personnel to set their goals and priorities and their covenants of action and impact, and then to resource them as they engage their particular ministries, and then to help articulate to our constituency the impact that those people are having. So that's primarily what my job entails.
Okay. So you mentioned impact a couple of times. One of the most impactful things that I can remember in my lifetime is happening right now with COVID-19. And obviously that's making an impact everywhere, not just here in the United States, but globally. And so what has the impact been on field personnel and what they do or are able to do, and what changes have come?
Yeah, you know, I would suggest close your eyes and imagine yourself, just you, on the other side of the world, and open your eyes again. And we have field personnel who are regular people who are impacted by this situation much as anybody else, with a few twists. You know, first of all, just like us, they were learning about the situation on the fly as countries were trying to catch up with what is the reality, what are the best practices. And many countries eventually, within a month, sort of initiated travel lockdowns. That's where things might differ a little bit. I have field personnel who have since March, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't have been able to travel home to the US to be with family. And in some cases, it's been very difficult where there's been an emergency or some event that really required their presence. Special dispensation has had to be sought and granted in order for them to travel. So apart from that, it's really forced field personnel to contemplate different ways of approaching their work. Now, there is an element of Sabbath in this particular situation. And so what we encouraged folks to do at the outset, while they were sheltering in place, is to reflect on where they were, to take a breath in this moment, to kind of help dispel the fear that might be building based on the unknown. Of course, a primary consideration for our field personnel was that we do no harm. You know, we didn't want any of us, including any of us, you know, we had to cancel a number of team meetings, global team meetings that were happening. And part of our determination before travel was actually banned was, in considering should we actually do this, was what danger would we be putting other people in if we were to travel from an area of pandemic and take it with us to infect innocent people. So we wanted to do that. We wanted to not let that happen. So sheltering in place became the norm initially. Of course, we're lucky we've got all kinds of communications, ways of communicating. And like you, we all began to make better use of those, whether it was Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or WhatsApp. And the beauty in our context is that we operate, CBF Global Missions, we really operate from a basis of partners and engagement with partners. So even where we were isolated, we still had partners. It's not all up to us. And we were able to communicate with those partners, sometimes nearby, sometimes far. And when you're oriented that way, it lessens the impact on your impact, shall I say. You can still function and you can still be relevant and you can still make a difference. One of the things that this has done, as you might expect, along with the do no harm sort of philosophy, is we didn't want to inject into this context visiting teams from the US. So when it became fairly clear what was going on, we immediately curtailed teams that were planning to travel to various locations. And it was a mutual thing for their protection and for the protection of the people that they were going to see. I'm grateful because my job entails I'm sort of Johnny on the spot when it comes to a disaster or something going on. I have to be engaged in that. On the eve of this, before it really became known much here, our field personnel in China were already well versed in what was going on, and they were facing an impending lockdown. And if you know about that particular situation, um, it was pretty dramatic. Like, don't go out of your house except for maybe one person in a week to get supplies. And that's how they were able to control in Wuhan, at least, the virus. So our field personnel were faced with a bit of a dilemma there. And we chose at the last possible moment to remove them from that context to a nearby country as sort of a hiatus. They're still there, waiting for permission now that China is okay, waiting for permission to go back and resume their language and culture learning and so forth. But that was really the only emergency sort of situation that was brought about by this initially.
Okay, I want to kind of come back in a different question to the mission teams question, but first I want to ask you about sort of the interconnectivity of our world. One of the interesting things, and I guess it's a good thing about this situation with the virus, is that it's made us really aware that the world is interconnected. None of us can sort of pretend anymore that what happens in Asia or Europe or Africa has no effect on us here in the United States. How do you see that playing out in global missions? Is that kind of awareness a positive thing for us? Do you think it impacts the way we will think about missions in the future, or ought to think about missions, or does it change the sort of the way we go about missions in the future?
Yeah, and I would say, we have long been of the mindset that the borders that the world imposes on us are artificial. And many of us have been of the mindset that the larger issues of our time, and in CBF Global Missions, we have extruded those to be global poverty, global migration, and global church. Those issues are transcendent in terms of boundaries and locations. And so COVID didn't change any of that sort of a mindset that we're looking at those kinds of connections. Let me give you an example. Global migration, for instance. We know of the incredible upheaval in the Syrian situation, occasioned by massive numbers of refugees fleeing war in that area, coming over to either North Africa, trying to get into Europe and beyond, and what that has occasioned over the last few years. And of course, we have seen some at one point, when they were allowed in, arrive at our shores. Those things aren't isolated incidents. They happen because of political factors. They happen because of environmental factors. Actually, one of the great catalysts for that disturbance in Syria was a prolonged 3 or 4 year drought where farming policy failed and there was no harvest. People crowded into cities, and that was then sort of became a powder keg for political upheaval. So nothing is isolated. Nothing has only one cause. And we would suggest that even what we do here in this country and our policies affect the globe. So if COVID has enabled us, that fact to dawn on us because of a pandemic, that's great. However, for those who are kind of looking in that direction to begin with, we understand that pretty soon in North America, there will be more Christians way outside the West than there will be inside. In fact, that's already the case. We'll see Christianity growing faster outside of the established citadel of Western Christianity. And that will begin to have an effect on us. You might be asking an African pastor to come and preach revival in your church. So we have, I will have to say, we were somewhat proactive already. Now, COVID has complicated matters. And it has made me thankful for one thing in particular, and that is we don't have sort of one-off freestanding ministries for the most part. We have a value on placing people in a place for a long term. They learn the culture, the language, they build relationships, and it's on that basis of listening to community that ministry begins to be formed. And so COVID, though it slowed things down and complicated matters, did not wipe the ministry off the face of the earth. It just helped us to proceed in a different way, and quite frankly, to rely more on our local partners. Melody and I invested 18 years in East Africa and built an organization that doesn't need me to come and shadow anymore. Certainly I'm a part of it, but we have Kenyans who are quite happy and quite able and quite willing to take that mantle. And as a result, ministry there has not stopped even during COVID. It was curtailed, but it wasn't stopped. And so it didn't rely on a Western North American missionary. We were part of the foundation of that work, but if we're doing our job, we are, as you've heard said before, working ourselves out of a job. So I would say that COVID has made all of this surface, but I'm grateful that we were oriented in that direction beforehand.
Yeah, yeah. So let's circle back to the mission teams question, because this is part of the work that CBF field personnel are typically engaged in, is inviting mission teams to come and experience their work, see their work, participate, build partnerships and relationships cross-culturally, which is very important on both sides of that equation. You know, there's an exchange there, as you're aware. You named your organization, Africa Exchange. There's a little bit of something in that. What is the future for churches as they're thinking about mission teams? Obviously, travel is a problem right now. Maybe it will be in the future also. What's the future as churches think about forming mission teams and their place in the mission endeavor?
Yeah, that's an important thought. And the short answer is we don't know. I'm certainly not willing to state after any form or fashion that, you know, volunteer missions is now over. I think COVID is not going to last forever. However, the situation has helped us to see what that might look like, right? So I stated out at the outset that our immediate concern was that we do no harm. So we didn't want to inject a problem, and we didn't want to have people in unsafe situations. And I will agree with you that CBF has employed field teams from churches here to support our field work very successfully in almost every location that we have field personnel. But I will say that our efforts don't collapse without teams. And I will say that our goal is not to have that work dependent on teams. But as you rightly state, there is a secret sauce that happens in the interaction. First of all, I'll just say it very plainly and crassly. In order to keep the interest of the American church, somebody has to be able to go and visit and experience and bring the message back so that people in churches feel this is a worthwhile endeavor. So there is a certain amount of interaction that's absolutely essential, because we're wired in that we're not going to give to something that's vicarious forever. At some point we need to go and see. And to me, the value in that is that when you go and see, you're going to go and learn. So it isn't only about, oh, we have to endure teams. Absolutely not. The whole enterprise of giving of oneself and going to be with God where God is working is predicated on the fact that people want to grow in their knowledge and understanding of how God is working. And mission teams is a vital and important way for that to happen. And I will say my worry in this situation is if the hiatus is too long, that public will lose attention. And so I guess my vaccine for that would be our Encourager Church relationships. That I would hope that individual churches have more than a superficial relationship with CBF Global Missions. That it's not only about doing your duty and giving at the end of the year to the offering for global missions, but it's that because it's something you believe in. It's part of who you are, and you have relationships with people who are in those countries because there are field personnel who visit you and relay that information to you and invite you to come and see. And you have sweat. Jeff, you've planted a tree that today is 20 feet tall and shades the entrance of Ngerenya Integrated Child Development Center. That would not have happened without you. And it's a benefit that lives on, but it's also something that you bring back to energize your congregation and your state and region. And it's based on that mutuality. So mutuality is the key here. Mm-hmm. And really that's what we're trying to foster. What I do and what I decide matters not only for me here, it matters on the other side of the world. And what better way to cement that by going and visiting. And plus, if you can't, or if you can, you need to be developing relationships that don't depend only on your going to visit. So that would be our invitation during this time, is to forge those closer bonds between the work there and the work here.
Yes. Okay. That's really good word, mutuality. I'm going to try to adopt that into my vocabulary. So this is a question off script a little bit, but you mentioned Encourager Church, and there may be some out there who aren't really aware of exactly what that means. Can you describe what that is and why it's important?
Yeah. So we've recognized that the era of mission responsibility, where it was just inculcated in individuals from the time they were knee-high to a grasshopper, that a thing that they're supposed to do is give to global missions and missionaries. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of the disinterest in global missions could be laid at the feet of that you're supporting an offering rather than supporting work and real people. On the other extreme, you have organizations and entities that are well known and probably preceded any cooperative program of individual missionaries depending for every single thing they do on how much money they can raise and go to work where they are. And many endured a lot of hardship because people at home forgot about them. What we have is really a hybrid situation, that our offering for global missions supports field personnel in their personal endeavor, salary, rent, and things of that nature, and that they interact and engage with churches for the programmatic aspect of that work. And it gives churches the opportunity to invest really in the work that's going on, and it gives missionaries and field personnel a type of security that they don't have to wake up thinking about where their next bite is coming from. So we realized that we had sort of let that lapse just a little bit, the enhancement of that relationship. And so we've spent the last 2 or 3 years, I would say even 5 years, really trying to emphasize the nature of a relationship that is an engagement between field personnel and churches in a more formal way, not just in a superficial way. That the work of field personnel depends on the church helping to support that work, and that the work is enhanced by the mutuality that exists in that relationship. And so we want to make it a dynamic thing. And I'll maybe say another benefit of that relationship is that surely in your own community, you have refugees, you have immigrants, you have people that would be desirous of your a relationship with you, there's a lot to be learned from an encourager church relationship where people share the things that they've learned together. And maybe what you've learned in your neighborhood can be used somewhere across the world and vice versa. So really it's about building capacity. So if a field personnel invests in an encourager church relationship with a congregation that you have, they're building their capacity to reach their local community. So it's not just something that has to do with the other side of the world. So what is it? It's essentially a covenant that a church has with an individual field personnel unit, or more than one if you like, where you covenant not only to pray for and communicate with field personnel, but that you've got skin in the game, that you support the offering for global missions, and also you use some of your resource to help the projects and the ministries that field personnel are engaged in. So it becomes a vital relationship, not just something that happens by accident. It's a covenant. It's actually a bond that is created.
Yeah,
And
it has that mutuality to it that you were discussing, where you grow in relationship, but you're also sharing all kinds of resources, you know, expertise and money and time and prayer and all kinds of facets.
Absolutely. So we're encouraging that. Ellen Seacrest, who is our church engagement manager for global missions, is really revolutionizing how many we have and how they're connected, and really has spent a lot of energy and effort in upping the game, so to speak. And we're really thrilled because we see that as the future of our movement.
Good, good. Well, in post-production, I'll flash up Ellen's email address over the top here. So another question, you mentioned earlier these sort of main areas of focus for CBF field personnel: global poverty, global church, and global migration. And I wanted to sort of drill in on global migration a little bit, because that seemed to, you mentioned earlier, that seemed to be in the forefront of a lot of people's minds prior to COVID. And so I'm curious, from a global migration perspective, what's happening right now, you know, in this particular environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would have to say that the data is not in terms of how COVID, I would only imagine that it has constrained global migration. Certainly it has created more negative possibility, because you have numbers of people in refugee camps or sleeping in the rough or whatever that makes them more susceptible to something like COVID. You have countries who are really wary and fearful of importation of the virus, so you've had a lot more clamping down. But global migration, those contexts that you allude to, global migration, global poverty, and global church, they're really, it wasn't something we invented. We just looked around and we determined this is the arena in which we're working. And the thing about global migration is, when I count up our field personnel, fully half of them are working directly with issues pertaining to global migration, whether that's in the US or domestic, or whether it's international. And so that's an aha moment when you realize, wow, we're oriented around this thing that happens to be a global reality. What kind of energies could we realize from this dynamic, and how could we build our capacity to do this work? And of course, it's also a phenomenon that impacts the church in the US just as much, really, as it would anywhere else. Now, I would say that in my presentations on global migration, people are often they're surprised to learn that the greatest global migration is not at the US border. Okay, the greatest global migration has happened in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East over the last 20 years. I mean, dramatically so, like 100 times. Now, that doesn't minimize the migration that's coming out of destabilizing forces in Latin America, it's not to minimize it. It's just to say that it isn't personal.
Yeah.
And migration goes both ways. In fact, my own learning in sub-Saharan Africa, when you look at the routes and the directions of global migration, they're circular. For a time, violence flares up, you run to the next country, and when it calms down, you come back. So it isn't as if everyone has this agenda of going to the West. There's a word I often use from a Somali poet. And she said, "No one flees home to go into the mouth of a shark." So, this thing of looking for brighter shores, that may be part of it, but it's nowhere near the main part.
Mm-hmm.
People are fleeing because they have to, because environmental degradation destabilized, Ebola happened, child soldiers got control, people left and went to the next country where they're exploited, and then they pay middlemen and they're shipped across the Sahara and they end up in Morocco and they're trying to get over a wall into Europe. I mean, these things have multiple factors. So looking at them as islands is not really conducive.
Yeah.
So yeah, global migration is a primary one within which at least half of our field personnel work. And it has application here.
Yes. Yeah. So before we move into kind of the right now and what churches and individuals can be thinking about, one of the questions that's come in is asking specifically about Haiti. CBF Heartland has had a partnership in Haiti for a few years now, working with Jenny Jenkins. And I believe last time I kind of communicated with Jenny, she was kind of still in lockdown like the rest of us. Do you know anything specific about Jenny and Haiti in general?
Yes. I caught up with Jenny just the other day. So things are sort of beginning to relax somewhat even there. There's not a lockdown. There was initially, you couldn't meet in groups larger than 5 people and so forth, but she has been able to venture out and resume construction of the mountain clinic that she's really focused on. And the word from her was that they have actually secured somebody to work on the road to make it actually easier to get up there. And there is, as we speak, some sort of a grader or bulldozer working on that road. And the masons are on site starting to pour the foundation. I know that she was wanting to get the foundation of a water tank in first, and she's moving forward. Now it'll be a while before she can take teams, but construction done well can continue to happen, and it is happening. So
that's good. I mean, that road, it's going to take some miraculous Haitian engineering to make that road passable.
Yeah. So she's been patient, hasn't given up, knows that her strengths and assets lie in the local people, and they're moving forward.
Good. That's great to hear. So let's think about the church experience. And, there's a lot of stuff churches are dealing with right now. And sometimes it is not at all helpful just to completely focus on one's self and one's own problems. It can be very beneficial to look with broader perspective at what's happening in the world. But we also feel like we're somewhat hampered by the current situation. So what can churches be doing right now to affect global missions, to help CBF field personnel, and to be thinking beyond themselves?
Yeah, and so my answer for that would be relationship. And it's why we're putting so much stock in the Encourager Church process. For those of your congregations who have already taken the time to establish an Encourager Church relationship, they're not having to wring their hands. They're actually saying, well, why don't we Zoom with so-and-so? Maybe they could even have a partner service and give us a personal update of what's going on in their particular context. So it's the opposite of being in isolation. and I think we all know during this time how difficult it's been, the isolation. So for field personnel as well, um, it's been difficult. Um, you know, not being able to, even if you wanted to, in some cases move. Um, things are continuing to happen with elderly parents, with family members, kids, your kids who are in college somewhere, and then suddenly they're bunking at someone's place because the school shut down, looking for a bed for your kids while you're in Spain or something to that effect. It's been hard. So it's happened to field personnel, and I feel like it's happening to all of us. That the tendency is for us to isolate and think that we're alone. So anytime we can put relationship in the front and say, but I have this asset, and that is I have a relationship with someone next door or across town or across the world, suddenly there begins to be a vibrancy and a vitality that wouldn't have existed if it was just about an offering. This is about a dynamic relationship. So I would plug again, Encourager Church. Plus, I would just, here's where faith is required. If faith is whistling in the dark, faith is required in order for us not to lose interest, because it's quite possible that I'm one of these people who was cursed most lately with the need for progressive lenses. And I'll tell you that when I'm at my computer using whichever branch of the vision it is, when I look up, everything is blurry just for a second. In fact, the other day I noticed even when I was walking, I was looking at the ground because that's where I could see. I had to force myself to look up long enough to see the tops of trees far away so that suddenly I could stop being dizzy because my vision had been compromised by what I was looking at. And if that could be a metaphor for how we engage the world, it's tempting and understandable. I'm not criticizing. It's understandable that suddenly our vision is right here because we're affected. But we can't live that way or we'll be dizzy. We need to look closer and look farther. It takes both in order to get a real vision, a 2020 vision. And so my encouraging of churches who are wondering, how are we going to survive? How are we going to meet and have services again? Forget about other people out there that we were ministering to. It's time to hunker down. Well, both of those things will die together if the vision doesn't open up and look around. So it's a challenge for us to engage in that. It's a challenge for us to lift up our gaze and focus, allow the time for our eyes to focus outside of our navel and take it all in and realize, I have a problem and I'm challenged, but the way that can be solved is through strength that comes from out there, not only from in here.
Yes, great point. So as you're talking to churches and, encouraging them to do that, what are some of the resources that you point to that you encourage churches to engage with as they're thinking outside of themselves? Is it books or websites or whatever it might be that you say, hey, start here?
Yeah. I was asked a question once if I thought, what role did personal discipleship play in mission? And I took that to mean something different than probably what was being asked. And I said, it is absolutely essential for an individual to understand who they are, how they are, and why they are, and what is their relationship to their surroundings in order for them to have any relationship out there. And so the short answer to that is, which is why we sort of endorsed a bit of sabbatical, was for people to refocus on the one that matters, the one that made them, the one that holds it all. And then from the security, or at least faith, from that standpoint, be able to embrace, instead of scarcity thinking, the God who holds it, and who is able to deliver. So use the time of introspection, use it well, but use it so that you will ultimately be focused outward.
Mhm.
Develop the resource internally that will enable you an external manifestation of that resource. Now, that's a very theoretical, or shall we say metaphorical way of looking at it. And you're asking really for practical resources. So apart from, the danger of falling victim to scarcity thinking, apart from what I've already suggested is that develop vital relationships. In terms of reading and resources of that nature that have really helped me, one that's been helpful to me is something called Toxic Charity. It is by the Lupton Center out of Atlanta. And it's helped me to sort of reframe how I look at how I am to be of assistance to a community. Anything having to do with asset-based community development. You've probably heard of the resource of When Helping Hurts. All of those things help you to reframe and put yourself in right relationship to need. That you're not the answer to it. You're not the primary focus, but you certainly have a proper role to play, and so do the people to whom you are going, and you should open up to what they have to say to you. Goes without thinking. I'll tell you my personal resource, and maybe this indicts me, or maybe I'm not really sure. I have gotten a tremendous amount of not comfort. My eyes have been opened by considering a Christ that is bigger than the one I had in a box. And someone who has helped me to do that is a Franciscan priest by the name of Richard Rohr. And when we begin to realize and understand that the Christ relationship is much bigger than we ever could have conceived, which allows us to recognize Jesus in other people. You talk to a volunteer that has come back from a mission trip, and one of the things I guarantee they're going to say is, well, I thought I was going over there to change somebody, but I was changed in the process. That can only happen if your eyes are open to the possibility that God is already there, and God working through somebody who you really don't understand might have something to say to you. And it could be that that person isn't the same kind of churchgoer that you are. And there's a possibility that that person has a relationship to Christ that looks a lot different than you and I do. And that is the Christ that has existed from the beginning, that made us, the cosmic Christ. And so that's, I know, very big in spatial thinking. And his name is Jesus. Yeah. If Christ had a name and needed to come to us in a person so that we could understand, and that's absolutely essential. And so if we can be more about that way of Jesus, we'll understand a lot more about other people, and we'll be understood better by them. And we will not threaten, and we will not hold all of the keys. We will be one family. Mm-hmm. We'll be able to give and receive the gifts that God has for us through Jesus.
Yeah, that's right. And, those lessons that you mentioned cross-culturally certainly have stuck with me through the years. I find it easier to do on a mission trip than it is when you're actually here close to home, and, making those things part of your everyday life. Right. Your neighbor right next door is sometimes much more difficult than traveling to Kenya and meeting people who are different.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So, one thing I wanted to ask before we go is just for you to share a little bit about Africa Exchange. This is, off script a little bit again, but you invested, as you mentioned, 2 decades in Kenya. You and Melody, I believe both of you are missionary kids from, really from Africa. You didn't move there. You moved back to the U.S. not the other way around. So tell us about Africa Exchange and the ways you continue to be involved and invite people into that work.
Yeah. Well, Africa Exchange was founded on something we've been talking about, which is really profound mutuality. That both sides in a conversation have something to give and to receive. In fact, one of our signature programs called Kutana, which essentially means that you meet someone and they have met you, that it's not a one-way proposition. Both are changed by that process. And so growing up as an MK, I noticed that there seemed to be this perception that the only good things were those things that came from the outside. And that there was this colonization of the mind that people had, and they had been sort of brought that way. And unfortunately, it was a legacy of colonialism that the real good is out there, and internally we just have to adapt. So it was an attempt at celebrating the internal Spirit of God within me that somebody had to celebrate, and that maybe the larger world needed to hear what that was, and that it's in the exchange that God is glorified. And so all of our mission trips, all of our cross-cultural engagements, whether they be mission immersion experiences, environmental components, Mercer on mission, all of those things that we've been privileged to conduct over the years, hopefully we have highlighted that mutuality. So in the context of meeting someone and being met by them, both sides are able to articulate what they need and what strengths they have to offer. And so one reality that dawned on us is that to change the equation of global migration, global poverty, etc., would be to care for children under the age of 6, to assist them with what they needed, which is not rocket science, to live healthy lives. And frankly, if people are concerned about things like overpopulation, the way to really address that is to keep children from dying. Because a family that has children that don't die will have less children. In the next generation, that problem will be solved. And so we began to attend to the needs of children under 6 through a program called Change for Children, and we've established 12 integrated child development centers around the country that continue under the direction of Mark Okello, who is a Kenyan who we mentored each other over the last 15 years. And yesterday, Mark was in a community helping them to start tree nurseries so that they can plant trees to stop soil erosion so that their children's water supply is not contaminated. And next week, he's going to be up in another area that's rebuilding a church with it's also a hall for a school that collapsed during the rainfall. All of this under local direction. Of course, we still rely to some extent on funding that comes from here, and so we're not shy of asking. But the strength and the actual ability to run the thing are Kenyan at this point. And we've groomed teachers and community members, helped to build their capacity through committees and so forth over the last 20 years, as you mentioned. We just pray that God will continue that good work.
Well, I was privileged to experience some of that. It's been deeply impactful for me. I continue to remember things that I learned, things that I saw, people that I met. And I think it's a model for how we can all sort of move toward deep engagement in the world and have that be a lasting impact for one another, not just for them or not just for us, but both directions. So
yeah, there's a chief in a town on the coast of Kenya that has actually a key to the city somewhere in Missouri, where Harold.
Yes, it's from here in Liberty, Missouri, I believe.
Liberty, there is a government-appointed African chief who has the key to Liberty, Missouri. So there's a relationship there.
Yes, I don't even have one of those, and I live here. So, Sam, I want to thank you so much for participating today, sharing your experience, your knowledge, helping churches to understand what's out in front of them and the good work and good things that they can do still in the world to engage with really impactful ministries and be impacted themselves. So thanks for sharing today.
Thank you. And if I could just offer a last word,
Sure.
because I know that you're also very involved with the McNairys.
Yeah.
I know that they're in communication with folks who love them and support them, but I know that they've been making a lot of masks recently to the point where the Red Cross asked for those masks. And they work on so many levels. That basic level, they're working on much larger issues of freedom of religion. Their work is dynamic outside of their immediate area and goes all across Europe. So I know that they've got a special bond with you, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that they were well and engaged and moving forward, just like Jenny.
That's awesome. Yeah, good news all the way around.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank
Hope you have the good rest of your day.
Enjoyed being with you.
All right, you too.